I saw an interesting incident at the mall a couple of weeks ago. We were parked out at Brea Mall by Sears, where you have those long parking lanes where you slant in and then you turn the other way and slant in. You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones that are never full or that are never empty when you get there? The ones where you have to park about 16 miles away, and you'd love to have a bus driving in like they have at Disneyland so that you could get in. Saw an interesting incident. We were getting ready to get in our car, and about 4 or 5 cars down from us, on each side of the parking aisle, there were 2 very nice ladies. One of them went out and got into her brand new 1986 Chevrolet Camaro. The other one went out and got into her brand new 1985 Mercedes. They both closed the doors. They both rolled down the windows. They both started the car, and they both backed right into each other. It was lovely. You know? I mean, I saw half a bank go down the drain right there. It was... I looked at Marty, and she looked back at me, and we couldn't help it. We both just kind of giggled a little bit because it was so dumb. I mean, here, both of these people have these very valuable cars, and neither one of them had the good sense to look behind them before they backed out. And I thought to myself at that time the same thing that I've thought when I chose a title for this lesson, and that is, people ought to know better. Just a little bit of common sense, you'd have looked out the back, and then they could have sat and argued over who goes first. That's okay. But at least you don't ruin your car. And I thought to myself, how silly. A couple of weeks ago, I had a phone call from a lady I'm doing some counseling with. She's not a member here, so don't try to guess who she is. But she started telling me some things that have happened in her life and some problems she's had. And then she said to me, she says, I can't seem to feel good about myself. I can't seem to get my life together. Things don't fit. I don't feel like I'll ever be what I used to be. Now, this is a lady who has traced for me a two-year period in which she indulged herself in any number of illicit sexual relationships. She has taken hallucinogenic drugs repeatedly while she is at the same time drinking heavily and taking medication. She now has gone through a complete nervous breakdown, which I think probably is much more than a nervous breakdown. I tend to think it probably was related to her rather eccentric lifestyle. Now she's trying to put the pieces together, and she can't seem to find all the parts. And it seems to me again that, my first reaction is, well, you ought to know better. And I don't mean that to sound calloused. I'm not saying, well, you're a dummy and I don't care about you. Obviously, the fact that I've been involved with her in this counseling process for upwards to 6 months now, and we are making progress, is a sign that I want to do something about it. But I can't help but think in my own mind, how dumb can you be? What do you expect? I mean, you go out and you pursue a lifestyle that is, by definition, self-destructive. And then you turn around a year later and you say, it just doesn't seem fair that my life is so self-destructive. Well, why isn't it fair? You set yourself up for it. You've asked for it. It's like walking up to the bully at school and saying, hey, I bet you can't knock me down. I mean, don't be surprised if you get knocked down. You've asked for it. You're just getting what's coming to you. And that's kind of what Paul is talking about in Romans 1, verses 18 to 32. Paul has just prefaced this discussion with what is the central statement of the book of Romans in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1. Now I encourage you to open your Bible and let's read that together. In Romans 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, I want to come to Rome and I want to share with you the gospel of Christ, because he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. For it is God's power to save to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Gentile or to the Greek. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from beginning to end. Just as the writer has said, the righteous will live by faith. Paul says, what I want, the central thing in life, the thing that really matters, is a man's relationship with God in the gospel. Paul says, that's why I want to preach. That's why I want to preach to you and I want to preach to everybody else. Because he says, I realize that the gospel is man's link with God. That the gospel is that connecting tube that makes it possible for man and God to connect spiritually. And he says, realizing that and realizing that it's only through the hearing of the gospel and the faith that it produces in the heart of a believer, realizing that's man's only hope of salvation, I burn within me to preach the gospel to you. But then there's the other side of the coin, and that's what Paul turns to, because in the next 2.5 chapters, Paul tries to build a case for the fact that every man needs the gospel. After all, any good salesman wants to convince his customer that he needs the product that's being sold. I'm not going to buy a car from your car dealership until you convince me that A, I need a car, and B, I need your car. Paul realizes that, and so he writes to this Roman church made up of a mixture of both Jews and Greeks. And he writes to persuade them of the universal need of man for the gospel of Christ. And so he talks about what happens to men when they reject the ways of God. He basically says 4 things, and I want us to look at those for just a moment each. And then the lesson's going to be yours, but I encourage you to think about it, because these statements may ring truer than we realize. First of all, Paul says in verses 18 to 20, whether we like to admit it or not, most people really know there is a God. That the question of atheism and agnosticism is not really an issue for most people. Now, I have people come to me all the time and they'll say, Doug, I'm having a problem with a friend at school. He says he's an atheist and I don't know what to say. You ever had a friend do that? Just don't talk to me, I'm an atheist. First of all, the reason most people make that statement is because they know that the word atheist just scares the living daylights out of Christians. And they know that most Christians are not philosophically equipped to deal with the kind of arguments that an atheist is going to throw at them. And so they know that by dumping that word on you, they're going to get you off their back just like that. Because generally when somebody says, I'm an atheist, Christians go, bing, red light, danger, danger, and they back away, and that's the end of it. The thing is, most people who say they are atheists don't understand what they're saying. I love to get a guy off to the side that says he's an atheist. My first question is, okay, what philosophic basis do you have for believing that you can prove there is no God? And they usually do something like, so what? You know, and the point is, the man's ignorant. He hasn't thought through the whole point. Because an atheist, philosophically, is a person who believes that he can prove there is no God. I want him to prove that to me. The first thing I want him to explain to me is the organization of the universe. I want him to define that for me in terms other than God. I want him to determine for me where man got a sense of morality, because no other animal on earth, if you give it the evolutionary side of it, no other creature on earth has a sense of morality. Where does he get a definition of morality? Where does it come from? How does he explain the human mind? How does he explain the concept itself of God? Where did man come up with that? Most concepts, abstract concepts, are rooted in some degree of reality. Where did that concept come from? And on we could go. But it's important here that what Paul is arguing, and this is so unfortunate because so many times in the church, those that feel that logic is the key to everything suggest to us from these verses that Paul is arguing that you can logically prove the existence of God, and that's not what Paul's saying here. Paul is saying that there is something basic in virtually every person on earth. Men know there is a God. They may not call him Yahweh as they did in the Old Testament. They may not call him the Lord or God as they do in the New Testament. But men know there is a God. And frankly, if you look at the rest of the argument in Romans 1, you'll find that Paul assumes that. He assumes that even the Greeks, although they worship a false God, believe in deity of some kind. Because his argument is not that they don't believe in God. The argument is that although they know there is a God, they don't recognize him. And they don't submit to him. But they know he's there. And whether we like to admit it or not, I think most of your friends and most of mine believe in God. If you were to go and ask the average Joe on the street or the girl, the friend of yours at school, do you believe in God? They would say what? Why, of course I do. Everybody believes in God. Why, we're a God-believing nation, aren't we? We believe in God. And Paul says that's the starting point. He says the wrath of God is revealed against these people, but look what he says. He says, what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the very beginning of the creation, ever since there's been a created universe, man has had enough evidence there to at least understand that there's something out there bigger than him. That's the point he's making. Because what two things does he say we can learn from the world around us? He says nothing about learning about the love of God or grace or salvation or any of those attributes. He says the thing you can learn from the world around you just by opening your eyes and using your brain a little bit is what? You can know that God is eternal and you can know that He has divine attributes. In other words, he says there is something about the creation that is built into the creation itself that says that the creation cannot explain its own presence. The creation itself is unable to explain its own existence. And Paul says that's why every man in every civilization in virtually all of history, every civilization has had some concept of God. Because there is enough evidence around us to tell us that the world and the cosmos in which we live is far too big to simply explain from some humanistic standpoint. Now, scientists try to do it today, but boy, they get into a mess when they get back into that primordial soup. They can get back to the soup, but they can't get beyond. They can't determine where the basic ingredients of the soup came from. They try to address the question of origins, but they can only go back to a certain point, and beyond that, they're logjammed. I don't personally accept evolutionary theory. Take man back to the primates, to the reptiles, to the fish in the sea where they supposedly came from, to the various lower stages of development, down to the one-celled amoeba. Where did it come from? Amino acids struck by lightning under the ideal conditions, which, by the way, are mathematically almost astronomical. But assuming all of that happened, where did the amino acids come from? Well, they came from chemical structures in the natural order of the universe. Where did the natural order, did you say, of the universe come from? Well, all of that was there at the point of creation. What creation? Well, the one where the planets formed from the swirling gases of the explosion of the primordial soup. Oh, there we go. We're right back to the starting point again, aren't we? Where the soup come from. The point is, Paul says take whatever route you want, you still end up at God, and most people have the good sense to know that. And that's true in our society today. Go through the mall and survey 10,000 people, and I guarantee you 9,995 of them will tell you they believe in God. That's number one. Paul says most men know there is a God. But number two, Paul says in verses 21 to 23, the problem has never been knowledge. The problem is in submission. And frankly, that's not only a problem that men have in the world, that's a problem we have in the church. We have a lot of people in the church who believe in God, but who do not really submit their lives to His will. And that's the point Paul makes here. He says, for though they knew God, see, the problem is not knowledge. We look at the world around us and we say, oh, those poor people, they just don't know God. You're kidding yourself. Paul says, of course they know God. The problem is they won't do anything with Him. You admit you know God and you believe in God, but you live like a heathen. Now what have you gained? You might as well not believe in God for all it's going to do you. Paul says, though they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but in their thinkings they became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for things, for images made to look like men. See, what we do is we create God in our image. Did you catch that play? Genesis 1:26 and 7 says God created man in His image. Doesn't say man created God in His image. But see, we've done that. Even in American society today, we've done that. You look at most people and you say, do you believe in God? And they'll say, well, sure I do. What kind of God do you believe in? Well, I believe in a God that loves everyone. I do too. But I don't believe in a God that condones everything people do. And I don't believe in a God that will save everyone regardless of how they live. Because a God like that is nothing but a big cheat on life. But you see, we've made God in our own image. I ask people all the time, do you believe in God? Well, yes, I do. Well, do you have any church affiliation at all? Well, no, I don't. We don't really ever go and worship. What does he say right here? It says what? Though they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. They didn't worship Him. They didn't recognize His right to demand of us that time of worship, that worshipful attitude in our hearts. Just dismiss that part. It amazes me many times in looking at the various moral communities we deal with, or immoral communities maybe. It's amazing how people get around certain things. If a fellow that preaches believes in the right to practice homosexuality and still be a Christian in good standing with no problems at all, he just simply walks around these passages that talk about the fact that that kind of lifestyle represents a perversion of the natural order that is the result of rebellion against the will of God. Now that's what Paul says in no uncertain terms here. And yet he'll read that passage and you'll point it out to him and he'll say, well, now that isn't what that means. Well, pray tell, what does it mean? What does it mean when it says God gave them up to shameful lust? What does shameful lust mean? How do you interpret that? I don't know how you grew up, but where I grew up, when somebody did something shameful, it was wrong. If a guy won the gold medal in the Olympics, they didn't walk up, pat him on the back and say, boy, that was really shameful. On the other hand, if a boy went out and took a rock and threw it and busted somebody's windshield, then, among other things, he would have it suggested to him that what he did was shameful. Paul says the problem is not knowledge but submission. They know God, but they don't submit to Him. They aren't willing to listen to what God has to say. We just kind of drift through life and we derive our own standards of right and wrong, and basically it becomes a social thing. Whatever most people think is okay is okay. So that we assume that God is kind of a mob mentality, kind of a cosmic group mentality is what God is. So that what everybody says is okay is okay. If sexual standards change, then evidently God has changed too. Now that's one to think about, isn't it? And it's one to think about in our own lives, because it's a question that bugs me when I think about my own life. Unfortunately, in my own thinking, many times the God I believe in, it's amazing how much He and I think alike. It's amazing how much His priorities and my priorities are the same. And I'm saying that, please recall, tongue-in-cheek. It's amazing how understanding God is with me. And He's not that way with you. But I have found that with me, He is gloriously understanding. I'll have a situation come up where I ought to do a certain thing, and I'll know I ought to do a certain thing, but I really don't want to do it. And it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's just a matter of my lack of commitment to Him in some area, and so I'll decide not to do it, and God has no problem with that. It doesn't bother Him a bit. He just loves me. I don't even need to feel bad about that, because it doesn't bother Him, so it surely shouldn't bother me. Of course, now you may miss the same thing, and I'll get to thinking about that, and I'll think, Don is a really bad guy. Because Don, Don was supposed to do something and he didn't do it. And that's shameful, and a Christian ought not act that way, and I think he's got a problem. See, it's always easy to look at the heathens of the world and say, boy, they don't submit to God, but I wonder if we do. Ask yourself that next Sunday morning during that special contribution. Number 3, Paul says in verses 24 to 27 that as a result of this rebellion against God, as a result of this flip-flop of priorities, where you begin to create God in the image of man rather than man in the image of God, where the desire of man is to conform God to what man needs God to be so that he can go ahead and live the way he wants to live without having to regard God as being truly his maker. As a result of that human rebellion, God says perversion takes place. Man begins to pervert the purposes of God for which he made man in the first place. Man created man with a purpose God created man with a purpose in mind, that man should submit to God and give God the proper worship and respect that he deserves, and that man might strive throughout his life to conform himself to the image of God that God has placed within him. In other words, to live up to everything that God meant us to be. That's God's purpose in putting us on the earth. But Paul says that when man rejects the authority of God in his life and refuses to submit to God, now he still believes in him. Keep that in mind. Oh yes, I believe in God, but he won't submit to him. He says inevitably the result is that man then begins to pervert the whole order of things. And all you have to do is look around you. I mean, do we really have to document it? Is there a day that goes by when you don't look in the paper or see a television program where various lifestyles that are just as anti-Christian as they can possibly be are being encouraged and promoted and even glorified in our society today? Paul gives the example in verses 26 and following, 26 and 27. He gives the specific example of homosexuality and lesbianism. There are probably a couple of reasons for that. The most likely reason is because that would be the most repulsive sin to a Jew. The other reason would be because it was one of the most commonly practiced sins in ancient Rome. It was something very common. If you ever want to read some good racy stuff, I guess I shouldn't encourage you to read good racy stuff, but if you ever want to read good racy stuff in the name of history, read the lives of the Caesars that are written by Tacitus. And you'll find that the Caesars were little more than just complete whacked out perverts. I mean, I don't know any better way to describe them. And we look at them, we look at Caligula and Nero and Claudius, and we say, well, those men were insane. Nero burned Rome, and Caligula once brought a mule into the Roman Senate dressed in senatorial robes and introduced the mule as one of the new Roman senators because he said the mule was so much like all the others in the room. We think it's sick that a Roman emperor should bear a child by his own mother. Have you ever looked around? You ever gone through Hollywood on a Saturday night? Those poor kids from Freed Hardeman came in and they went down to Disneyland on Friday and they came back Friday afternoon and they said, you know what we'd really like to do? I said, what? We love to see Hollywood at night. I told them, I said, your only problem is going to be getting somebody dumb enough to take you. You know, if you can get somebody to take you, you're welcome to go, but I don't know of anybody in this area, in the church, that's in his right mind that's going to drive anybody through Hollywood after dark. I'm not sure I feel too good about driving through Hollywood in the broad daylight. And I'll never forget the first time I came out here, preached a gospel meeting for the church in El Monte, and a friend of mine and I got together and we were going over to Hollywood that evening. We were going to go to Mann's Chinese Theater. Star Wars had just come out. And, you know, everybody was saying, you got to see Star Wars. So we went to Mann's Chinese Theater to see Star Wars on that gigantic, you know, King Kong size screen with all that sound that comes from the inside of your head out instead of from the outside in and all that. We were driving down the road in Hollywood, driving down the main drag there, and this lady, who was obviously about 3 sheets to the wind, she was long gone, came staggering out right in front of our van and tried to get in the car, and was saying various words of encouragement to try to get us to, let her in. And, I'd never seen anything like that, and it just blew my mind. I've heard of forward women, but that's a little bit too much. The thing that amazes me, and that is, I look back on it as kind of an amusing initiation into worldly culture on this end of the world. That's just not terribly unusual. It really isn't. If you live around church folks and hang out with church folks and only associate with church folks and never talk to anybody but church folks, then you won't see that. But if you go more than 2 blocks away from this building, you're going to run right into it. It's just all around us, folks. The whole order of things is unnatural, and what it tells you is where our society is going in relation to what they know about God and what they're not doing in regard to that knowledge. Number 4, Paul says that not only do you have a perversion that progresses out of this rebellion, but that eventually in verses 28 to 32 it leads to a spirit of approval. You see, that's where your problem comes. And that's where we may be getting in trouble in the church a little bit. Is that we've seen it so much. We've been around it so much. We've worked with it so much that we're beginning to get to the point that it doesn't bother us anymore. And that ought to concern every one of us. Oh, well, it doesn't matter, does it? Well, sure it matters. Because we're talking about men created in the image of God who are not living in the image of God. Men who are perverting the natural order of things. Men who are refusing to submit to the God they know. And are pursuing lifestyles that are self-destructive. Paul says that the sexual perversions of his age are just the tip of the iceberg. And when you look at the other things that are mentioned, you begin to get the full picture of the whole thing. Gossips, slanderers. I was talking with Brother Doyle, the director of the Free Hardeman Chorus, about some of the things that go on back there in the church. And of course, I'm not going to go into all that now, but it amazed me. One fellow went out to a little country church and made a very innocent statement, and a member of that church called a preacher from another church and repeated the statement out of context. And the preacher of the other church called the president of the college and told him that the fellow was teaching a certain thing which he'd never said he was teaching. And the president of the college called the faculty ethics committee together and called this vice president of the college in and took him through a 4-hour inquisition to make sure he was sound in the faith. Now, I'm sorry, folks, you may not think that's on the same par with homosexuality and those kind of things, but God says it is. Because what you have is, you have a gossip telling a tattletale who tells a Pharisee. And so far as I know, gossips and tattletales and Pharisees are all condemned in the Bible. We really need to take a hard look at ourselves, both in the church and then in the world, and ask ourselves, are we really living according to the God that we believe in? Or perhaps the better question is the God we believe in the same God that you read about in the Bible? Maybe we're believing in the wrong God. Not talking about a spirit of self-righteousness and that sort of thing. But folks, we need to learn as Christians to call them as we see them. And if the Bible says that's wrong, it's wrong. And you can't look at it and say, you can love the people. And you can work with them to rebuild their lives, but you still can't look at the wrong and say it's right. We can't let the church become a voice of approval for the rejection of the will of God in the lives of men. And the best way we can countermand that is to do exactly what Paul says he wants to do in verses 16 and 17. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it can do the job. The strongest argument that a Christian has against the standards of the world is the preaching of the gospel. If we'd spend half as much time in the church preaching the gospel as we do tattling on one another, we'd convert the world in a generation. And then we wouldn't have to be so concerned about those kinds of things. You're never going to change pornography until you change the pornographers. You're never going to change dishonesty until you convert the dishonest. You're never going to change adultery until you convert the adulterer. And so perhaps instead of campaigning on issues, we ought to become people who campaign on souls. Now that might not be a popular statement, but I believe the Bible teaches it to be true. Christians in the first century were not issue-oriented, they were soul-oriented. They did not abolish slavery by changing the law. They abolished slavery by converting the masters. If you're not a Christian this morning, let me encourage you to serve the God you believe in. Make sure you believe in the right God, but once you believe in Him, serve Him with all your heart. Don't fudge, don't hedge, don't hold out on Him. Give your life to Him. Let Him rule you supreme. Let Him be your Lord and Master. Come to Him this morning in faith. Repent of your sins. Confess your love for Jesus. Be immersed into Him for the remission of sins. I wonder as Christians if we're really serious about this game called Christianity. I wonder if it really means as much to us as it means to our God. He gave His Son. Perhaps we end our thought this morning by asking, what have you given to Him?